here we go. And all these sessions are recorded, and we place them on our YouTube channel. And feel free to check it out. I'd like to thank PASS for giving us this opportunity to have these events, and I'd like to thank everyone for showing up today and and watching the webinar. And if y'all ever have questions, you feel free to email us. And today I have a special speaker, friend of mine, who actually got me involved in the SQL community here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He asked me to speak at a few sessions at the SQL, the PASS local chapter, and it's really a great pleasure of mine today to welcome William Assaf, and he's going to give a presentation for us. And he is the president of the local chapter, which is really awesome. He volunteers a lot of time, and it's really amazing how much time he gives to PASS. So without further sessions, I'm going to turn it over to William. I'm going to change the presentation and let him go from there. And thank you, William, for coming today and talking. So let's see if we can get your screen going here.
Let's see. All right, can you see a OneNote presentation?
I got it now. We're rolling.
All right. Well, good afternoon from chilly Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where the temperature briefly dipped below freezing last night. It's 48 degrees Fahrenheit outside right now. Talk about a polar vortex, right, Rob?
Yes, extremely cold. That's very cold.
Just joking with you guys up north. Stay warm. For those of you who are curious or watch too much television, despite the cold last night, I want to let you all know that my P-robe was not frozen in the swamp. My pet alligators are doing fine, and we still have high-quality H2O. I'm kidding, of course. In fact, it's so nice in Baton Rouge that I'd like to personally invite all of you to come to Baton Rouge SQL Saturday this August on the beautiful campus of my alma mater, Louisiana State University. Come join more than 500 of your best friends at one of the biggest SQL Saturdays in the world. Last year we had 13 tracks and everything from SQL.NET, SharePoint, Windows, PowerShell, career development, and more.
Hey, William.
Yeah.
Your voice is kind of fading in and out a little bit, so you might want to just talk. All right. Come a little closer to the mic here.
Got it.
Thanks.
Okay, so yeah, we're not quite officially announced yet for the SQL Saturday in Baton Rouge. It's not quite up on SQLSaturday.com yet, but it will be soon. We're just pending some paperwork. I'd also like to invite all of you to the Baton Rouge SQL Server User Group, which starts meetings together with a .NET group, a SharePoint user group, and coming soon, even a Java user group. We're going to be nice to them. At the Louisiana Technology Park in Baton Rouge. For more information, please visit brssug.org. I'd like to thank Rob Canzaneri from Blue Cross Blue Shield today for organizing today's virtual chapter meeting and for also winning the last Baton Rouge Speaker Idol for user groups. Representing the SQL Server user group and once again carrying the DBAs to victory. Good job, Rob, and one day maybe we'll let those .NET guys win one.
Oh, they hope.
My name is William Assaf. I'm president of the Baton Rouge SQL Server User Group and chair of our annual SQL Saturday event, which is going into its 6th year in 2014. I work at SparkHound, which is an IT consulting company with offices in Baton Rouge, Houston, and Dallas. I work in a department of 25 or so .NET developers, and I'm a DBA guy that they all poke fun at. In addition to app dev, SparkHound also offers consulting services around SharePoint, core infrastructure, application support, project management, and business consulting, as well as a support services desk. For more information, please visit our website at sparkhound.com. Now that we're all friends, let me get started on today's topic. I've given this same presentation in different settings, and my favorite is to give it at the university level, usually in the senior level database class or at a club meeting like the AITP, where I actually have a real whiteboard and marker pens to work with while I'm explaining this stuff. So for this webinar, I'm going to use a Wacom tablet that I stole from my daughter and OneNote, which works very well, actually, I find. If you have any questions during the presentation or you can't read my handwriting, please use the built-in question function in the webinar, and Rob will chime in to let me know. I will have my content info for this presentation as well as a link to download the finished whiteboards and the recording at the end of this presentation. So all of that will be at the very end. So let's get started. First topic I want to talk about was a project that SparkHound had to, the SparkHound got to report funds used by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or ARA, or the first Obama stimulus package. Specifically for the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, they needed a system to collect and report in a number of different ways on money spent, progress of the projects, of road projects, and the number of jobs created. I'm going to go to my first whiteboard here, and this should be blank, and I'm going to start drawing boxes. So this project included importing a lot of legacy data from various systems. So we had an Oracle input. Wow, I messed up that C and the L. We had DB2. We had other SQL servers. And we had some flat files as well that all needed to be brought in. We brought these in to a first SQL Server database for staging purposes only. And we brought the data in as raw and native a format as possible. And that was very important because a lot of this data was legacy, so it did not have the best front ends to it. And a lot of it was unsanitized, so we had just regular text fields that should have been holding numbers and dates, but there was no validation on the front of them. So we had to do a lot of data scrubbing, but we did not do this in the very first step. We wanted to get it all into a single platform. And so this staging environment was very raw. The data types were very loose, and we just wanted to get all the data into SQL Server so that we could use T-SQL to do our data scrubbing. And we accomplished that, of course, with SQL Server integration services. A lot of this presentation I'm giving right now, we're going to cover all the different features of SQL Server that come with the license. Because in order to give a much higher level view of how all these features can work together in a large project. And this was a pretty large multi-year project that we developed. So after we got all the data from all these disparate data sources into a single staging database in SQL Server, and all not joined yet together, we wanted to pipe all that data first into a normalized SQL Server database. Oops. So this normalized SQL Server database, hold on one second. Okay. Let's go back up here. Somehow it stopped drawing. All right, so to get to our second database, let me go back to that bigger pen. This was a normalized database. And so in addition to doing, come on now, in addition to doing our data scrubbing and our data sanitation and validation and things like that, this data was being normalized and joined together into a proper third normal form database to satisfy all the different problems that we had to solve with it. So we had many different project tables in the Oracle, the DB2, the SQL, and the flat file systems. We had many different project keys. Those were all brought in together, and in the normalized database we had a project table, a vendor table. And all that was brought together. And it was very important, and this is where we spent a lot of our time. I keep doing that. I was singing OneNote's praises, and it heard me. That's the problem.
I don't think it likes you right now.
Yeah, so this is where all our data scrub kept happening. And this is where we spent most of our time. That was very important. So what did we do with that normalized database? We had a web app on the Department of Transportation and Development that would serve different reports and project statuses and things like that. We had an XML output that met federal guidelines that went to, I'm not going to attempt to draw it, but it went to the White House for reporting on whitehouse.gov about the stimulus package. That was obviously very important, and that was a critical piece of this application. And then we also had some SSRS reports that were used internally for the Department of Transportation and Development to look at some things, especially around the error handling and the error status of these data imports from all the different systems. That web app, by the way, was, in addition to reporting stuff, it was also a data input. There was a special part of the website that would receive data from the different contractors and road vendors about the project status that they had to fill out weekly, the amount of money that had been spent, and the amount of jobs that they were using, the amount of people they were employing each week. And so that data was brought together with all the existing legacy data to make a very rich source of data for the state and for the White House. The way that we got the data into the normalized database is something I wanted to talk about. So we had a schema for the warehouse, for example. Maybe it was called DOTD. We also had a parallel set of tables in an error schema. So all the data that went into the real, and I said warehouse earlier, but I meant normalized, all the data that went into the real database had a parallel set of tables in the error schema that hosted problems with data. So if a varchar 10 field was in the real table, we had an error schema table that contained a varchar 50 field. If we had a date field that was a date data type, we had a varchar 30 or something like that. A very wide, very generous. So even if some data got past our data scrub and would fail on import into the normalized database, we would capture that data in an error schema table. We had all sorts of reports based on that error schema table, nightly reports that would tell them about problems, where that data came from, for example. And then the different owners of the Oracle, the DB2, the SQL, and the flat file systems could use that error data to go and fix their own problems, resolve those data issues so that it could be imported into the system the next night, or if it was a critical issue, right away. That was very important for us to be able to report on and never lose any data, even if it couldn't go into our tables because it violated a constraint or it violated a data type. And so that was our second ETL in the data scrub, which populated the normalized database. We also had a third ETL using SQL Server Integration Services that went to a dimensional design for a SQL data warehouse. And if you're not familiar between the differences between a normalized and a dimensional data warehouse, that's probably another presentation. But the dimensional data warehouse was based upon the massive reporting and the aggregations that they wanted to do. And what does everybody put on top of a data warehouse? They put the most challenging thing you can try to draw, a data cube. All right, not bad, not bad. And so this was based on SQL Server 2008 R2. So this was an analysis services cube in the traditional multi-dimensional mode. We're going to talk about how that's changed in SQL 2012 and how much better that is. But this was our OLAP cube. That was SSAS, SQL Server Analysis Services. What did that do? Well, that contained the data from the data warehouse, and it aggregated up and it pre-calculated all the different aggregations that we wanted to do. So if we wanted to know project cost by vendor, by parish, which is what we call counties in Louisiana, by congressional district, that was very important. If we wanted to know the number of jobs that were created on different projects over many different measures, that's what the OLAP cube was for, and that's how we served that kind of reporting. And so who consumed that? We had power users that consumed that data with Excel, just using pivot tables and later on Power Pivot. We had SQL Server reporting services that could report just as easily off of the OLAP data in the data cube as it could in a normalized database. And then we also had, we had a lot of reports based in SSRS, and then off the data warehouse and off the cube we also had more public web reports in the cloud or on the website. And so the difference between this was a normalized and this was the dimensional design, and that's very important to realize because they served very different reporting purposes. First off, the data warehouse was only updated nightly. It was not updated throughout the day as the normalized database was. The normalized database was optimized, as everybody knows, for reads and writes, whereas the data warehouse was optimized for massive reads and massive aggregations. And so there's pretty much the end-to-end of this project. One more thing I wanted to draw on here was that we had what was called a matrix document. And this was very important in the UAT, the user acceptance testing phase of our project, and in testing and development especially, or when things changed from end to end. This matrix document contained the data in the source databases, and it tracked that data as it moved to our staging environment, to our normalized environment, to our data warehouse, and even, if necessary, into the cube, so that at any given point in the reporting process, if they noticed on a report that this value isn't correct, or that value is bad, or this calculation needs to include this or that, we could track the data field from the cube to the data warehouse, to the normalized data, to the staging table, all the way back to the Oracle table if need be. And of course, all the name changes and data scrubbing processes that went along the way. Also in that matrix was, for every table, what its unique identifier was, what the keys were, and what the foreign key relationships were. Any ETL rules that we had when we were changing things, we would document there. So if we were reformatting a name field into distinct first name and last name fields, for example, that would all be documented in this matrix document, which was a living, breathing document that was maintained and changed throughout the life cycle of the application. Any questions on that, Rob, that have come up? Because I'm ready to move on. That was very, go ahead.
I'm not seeing any questions right now,
okay,
so
cool.
I guess we can go on.
Cool. I hope that's useful to everybody. The next project that we had was a, notes about it, was an internal data warehouse and reporting system for a large auditing firm that had an army, literally, an army of auditors and thousands of claims to process through a complex multi-step workflow.
William, we do have one question here basically it says, is the matrix like your data dictionary?
The matrix is very much a data dictionary, and that's a great question. There were many fields in there to describe, especially in the early stages in the staging area, what that data was. What its explanation was, because as you can imagine, a lot of these legacy systems had 8-character names, even cryptic names, right? Even duplicate names from table to table. And so it was very much a data dictionary. It was also a table structured document, which mapped out all the different data types and relationships between the tables. And really, our data mapping document was the best purpose that it served. So really, it was all of those things together. But that's a great question. All that data dictionary stuff that you would typically put in, data definitions for the developer behind you to follow up, or the ETL developer to use, that was all in that document. Great question. Anything else?
We do have another one here. The staging database has some identifiers which are different from the diff database. I'm trying to understand the question here.
So maybe how do we do?
Which are different? Differ. I guess what he's trying to say. How does it differ? The staging database.
So that's maybe a time to talk about the surrogate keys that we used. At every stage, the data would pick up a new surrogate key, but we would keep the keys from before. So the project identifier in the staging tables would be listed in the staging table, and would probably be more identifying in the staging table than they would in the normalized table, where that each project key from each system would be stored, but they would pick up a new project key, a surrogate key, usually an integer identity column. So the project ID, and therefore the primary key for the normalized tables, was not anything that came from the Oracle DB2 SQL. It was a new surrogate key, but we kept all of the keys from the previous system so that we could reference back to the Oracle key or the DB2 key or the SQL key. Because you can imagine each one of those keys, each one of those systems had different keys, or at least different primary keys that were related to surrogate keys for the other systems. They had to have a way to relate the Oracle and the DB2 and the SQL projects together, but they also had their own keys for each system. And so the staging database stored all that, all the heterogeneous data coming from all the source systems in as raw and a native format as possible. They were not combined and they were not normalized until they hit the normalized database. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, we have two more questions here. One of it is how much time did ETL take, and how much time did it take to serve up new batches of data to the end user?
That's a great question. The ETL development was on the scale of months, and to break out ETL 1, ETL 2, and ETL 3 would be difficult. But I do know that ETL 3, because we didn't really have any data issues at that point, We didn't have to worry about any kind of sanitation. ETL3 was the easiest. ETL1 was tricky because we were dealing with different drivers and different systems, and each source data was different. ETL2, where we did the data scrubbing and where we did the normalization of the data, was by far the most time-consuming development effort for an SSIS package developer. And that's what it was. We used only SQL Server features and products in this system. We've seen the database, SSIS, SSRS, and SSAS. Designing the different systems was also pretty time-consuming. We always went with a develop with the end in mind approach. So with the XML data, with the different reports that were at different endpoints throughout the system, we always designed based on reporting requirements, and then moved data from the staging system, from the data sources to the staging to the normalized to the data warehouse, only if it was needed to join the data together or to serve an existing report. We did not take the approach, and this is a very common mistake, we did not take the approach of taking all the data in Oracle, all the data in DB2 for the affected tables, and dump them in. That really complicates and clouds the development process when you're trying to develop things. And so for a lot of the tables in those source systems, we only took a handful of columns, definitely not the whole table. From what he said about the nightly run of the warehouse took, I believe, on the order of an hour to do this. That doesn't really tell you a whole lot. We're not really sure in this presentation how much data we were dealing with. But to move it forward, and that included accessing the staging systems all the way to processing the data cube at the end. It took about an hour, and that was acceptable to the client overnight. I hope that answers that question.
Well, we have a few other questions here. I'll just shoot them at you. All right. So one question is, I think what they're trying to ask is, did you use what ETL tools did you use? And I think you mentioned just SSIS, correct?
SSIS, right out of the box. Yep.
Yeah.
And so at that time, it was called Business Intelligence Design Studio that we were using in SQL Server 2008.
Yeah. Sequential stages, or were there some parallel parts? Oh, I think he's asking you, did you do it in parallel, any parts of the task?
No, this was actually fairly sequential. We could not populate, we could not process the cube, we could not populate the data warehouse, we could not populate the normalized data until we had the staging data from the source databases. So no, this was fairly sequential. It was ETL1, followed by ETL2, followed by ETL3. The web app, this thing at the top in the middle right here, was writing to the normalized database at all times, and that was a known factor because people from the different vendors and from the different construction companies were putting in data at all times. So, but as far as the ETL goes, the nightly warehouse run goes, and that's what we referred to it as, even though it affected all different parts. It was fairly sequential. We could not do any of it in parallel. Now, importing the Oracle data was done in parallel to the DB2 data. So these pipes over here to the left, we did not do Oracle and then DB2. Those things were independent of each other, and they were writing the different tables in the staging database. But all that had to finish, and not necessarily successfully, because we had different error handling in mind, before ETL2 could run, before ETL3 could run. Good question, though.
Okay, we have two more. Wow.
All right. Well, but yeah, let's do two more because I want to stay on track to get the other two projects out of the way.
Warehouse dimensions on your diagram, and that's all he puts.
Warehouse so the facts and dimensions table for the dimensional design would be in here, where I'm drawing a dot right now, for the purposes of this diagram. Do you think that's what he meant?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And the last question we have here, so was the data from these, was there any other data, I guess, sources for the reporting? Did you get data from any other sources?
Any others? Man, we got them from just about everywhere we could, right? We had straight data pipes in from Oracle and DB2 and the legacy SQL Server system.
You're fading out.
Say again?
You're starting to fade out a little.
I don't know why I would be fading out.
Oh, maybe it's my mic. Hold on. Okay, there we go.
All right, I hope everybody can hear me still. The flat files are actually the most challenging, obviously. common limited files are way more challenging to bring in than anything that is a straight database connection. So that was definitely most challenging. And that flat files box down here included a number of different data sources. We actually had some of those flat files were actually Excel files that we treated like flat files to bring in. But we had comment delimited and pipe delimited files as well. Those were very challenging, and the validation, especially of them over time, because those kind of files tend to not be consistent. Over time, those things were the most challenging part. In comparison, the SQL Server and the DB2 and the Oracle connections were pretty simplistic. It was just a matter of finding the right driver, and we had some 32 versus 64-bit issues there. It was just a matter of finding the right driver to get SSIS to connect directly to the Oracle, the DB2, and the SQL systems. All right.
Okay.
Okay. Let's go back. Let's go back on board to this this internal data warehouse. Again, we had a large auditing firm, an army of auditors, thousands of claims to process, and a complex multi-step workflow with different statuses and stages and checkpoints along the way. The auditing managers wanted to observe the performance of their teams from the individual all the way up through the management chain, and also to use the timestamps of the status codes to find checkpoints and ways to increase efficiency. So if they noticed that there was a big choke point between statuses 3 and 4, they would want to be able to see that. And maybe some teams dealt with that choke point better than others. So you can already see the different measures and facts and dimensions in this data warehouse. They started small and used a single SharePoint list to track everything that had to do with each claim. But that obviously scaled up very quickly, and they needed a way to pull their data out into a SQL Server warehouse where they had a number of power users who were already developing manually driven reports in Excel. Because they needed each transaction, we couldn't just snapshot SharePoint at every 15 minutes, for example. Because if a status changed 3 times in that 15 minutes, we needed each of those status changes. So to satisfy that, we used SharePoint version history. So I'm going to draw SharePoint right here, and we have the ribbon across the top, and blah blah blah, and an image, and here we go. And we had a giant list with data fields along each one. This list would end up containing thousands, and each one had version history to it. There was no pretty way to get that data out, unfortunately. What we ended up doing, after trying a number of different things, was developing a custom .NET app which would scrape each row's version history and each version history for each column as well. Using the APIs in SharePoint, we were only able to access one version history at a time, which made for a very painful and slow process. We're talking about something that could not be easily completed within the scope of a day. With this custom .NET app, the way that they access that, and that is not what I do, and that's a little above my head, with the way that they did that, we were able to start pulling out all the version history in just a matter of hours, which means that our nightly data warehouse was within the scope that the client needed. So this custom .NET app would run on the server, and it had to run on the app server, by the way. It could not run detached on the SQL server. It had to run on the SharePoint app server. To push version history, again, very important that we had that history, to, I don't know why it keeps popping out to text mode like that. If anybody has any ideas on why it keeps popping over to text mode, I would love to answer that. To a SQL staging database. That staging database also had a whole bunch of flat files, basically Excel files and other flat files, to go in with it. And so we ended up with a whole bunch of data from flat files, from Excel files, and SharePoint version history to go along with. And the difference was that the SharePoint stuff were coming from our auditors, and the flat files were coming from other auditors, and that all had to go together to make one big picture about how these things were moving through time. So the staging environment, just like in our last project, brought in all this data in as raw and a native format as possible. Even in SharePoint, we had issues with sometimes the SharePoint field was too large. It was much larger than it needed to be, and so accidentally data could go in. We ended up working with the SharePoint developers to get all the SharePoint date fields, by the way, changed over to official date picker fields, not just text fields. To change over all the names to user fields, not just plain text fields with somebody's name in them. And then the date types all to actual date types with timestamps in them, all the way down to the second. We didn't really need precision down below that. So again, we had a staging database in as raw and a native format as possible. We hadn't joined any of this data together yet, and it sat in tables that were assigned to the different sources. So nothing was joined, nothing was normalized, and it was all flat. So ETL1, well, actually ETL2, we called this ETL1 because this data came in a bunch of different ways. ETL2, again, all SQL Server integration services, that was the only tool we were using, had a lot of data scrubbing. A lot of data scrubbing to get it straight into a SQL data warehouse. And that was, and you'll notice we skipped a bit. We did not go to a normalized project. Not every project, not every large data application like this needs to have a normalized database. You gasp and say, but William, we're all DBAs. We have to normalize data, right? Well, in this case, there just was not the need for it. There were no applications to read and write data into a normalized database. There was no need to normalize the data for other reporting purposes. Most of the reporting that we wanted to do was on a much grander scale, which involved massive aggregations of measures among various dimensions. Well, that just screams a data warehouse. So we had a dimensional design here, not normalized. So that means facts and dimension tables with large primary key, compound primary keys, and things like that. Not a lot of broken out many-to-many tables, for example. And that, of course, sat, on top of that sat a data cube. Can I do it? Not bad. More like a data loaf of bread. That's cool. That's cool. The big difference here, though, was that this was the tabular mode of SQL 2012 SSAS. If you've worked with this before, let me finish writing this out. If you've worked with this before, you'll know it is much easier to present most of the functionality of SSAS inside tabular mode with a skill set that is a lot closer to Excel than MDX. And if you've ever dealt with MDX and you're really good with T-SQL, you know that MDX is so close to T-SQL that it actually hurts you because it's so different. It looks too close. Anyway, if you're curious, you can't really be very, very good at both T-SQL queries and MDX queries in my experience and in other people that I've talked to. Tabular, though, breaks that down. We were able to develop the data warehouse in this tabular SSAS mode in a fraction of the time it took us in the previous project to develop the multidimensional data warehouse cube. A fraction of the time. We're talking weeks as opposed to months. So it was a big deal, and this was, to me, one of the bigger selling points of SQL 2012. Not that I am selling SQL 2012. But based off of that, we had Power Pivot reports. We had Excel reports from our Power users that were already in and loved the data source. We had these Power users who were using both of those things. We also had SSRS, obviously looking at this. And based off those SSRS reports, and I was stunned to find this out, a bunch of executives used their iPads to look at the SSRS page. And guess what? It worked perfectly. They told me that one morning, and they said, hey, they looked at the SSRS reports in their iPads, and it worked great. And I said, of course it does? Really? I was very surprised to learn that, and it looks fine. They did not need to, although they explored some third-party plugins to allow SSRS on Apple products. They didn't need them. And then they had email subscriptions so that middle managers could get notified of their team's performance every morning based on the data warehouse's run. All those reports, by the way, contained the last run of the database. So if we ever had a problem in the morning, all the managers would know about it right away because they would look at the very top of their reports that said data warehouse last run or data last updated warehouse last updated, I think actual text was, and it would show the date that it finished, and usually it was 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, right? If we ever had any problems with the overnight run, that date would still show the previous night, and so the managers wouldn't be all up in arms about their data not changing. They would just understand that the warehouse was still processing. That, in the end, was a much better way to communicate that, because giving the user the impression that the data was up to date was a lot worse than giving the user clear information that the data was not up to date yet. And there were still emails, but I think they were able to use that data of when the data warehouse was last updated a lot better. So what kind of data did they get out of the data warehouse? They had trending data. They had durations between statuses, which proved enjoyably difficult, enjoyably interesting to develop for them. And different status buckets as well. It wasn't just when did it move from 2 to 3. It was when did it get out of this zone of 2, 3, 4 and into 5. And then some of the statuses were optional. It didn't always have to go to status 5 and 6. Maybe sometimes it went to 4 and 7. Very fun to do. We had the classic org roll-ups. They had a hierarchy stored in the user tables of SharePoint, and they were able to show the analysts all the way up through the different levels of their pyramid, all the way up to the directors, with performance accordingly and by time. And so then team performance was very important too. And similarly, and very important, was also our matrix document, which mapped things all the way back to these different Excel files, included all custom calculated measures that existed only inside the tabular data cube that were not in the data warehouse. So this matrix document was, again, very important for us. On a report, and because we used a very, I don't want to say agile because I'm not really sure all that goes with it. The .NET guys like to make fun of me when I say things like agile and Scrum. But when we had a very rapid pace of prototyping our SSRS reports in front of clients, they were used to seeing these reports before they were even officially published for production. We had to go back and find out where that data was coming from and be able to tell the user the source fields, because that's all they knew. Our users didn't have any idea of what was in our data warehouse. They were not familiar with the design, but they were familiar with these source Excel documents and with the SharePoint fields. So it was very important for us to tell them how that data mapped all the way from their iPad back to the SharePoint list and was combined with those Excel documents. All right. Well, that's about all I have to draw on here. Do we have any questions coming in?
We just have one question. It's more about your hardware. They're interested in what are you using to do your whiteboard?
I'm using a Wacom Bamboo tablet. I think it's like an 8-inch by 6-inch tablet, and the drawing pen that comes with it, and then OneNote.
Wow. Which
keeps switching back to type mode for some reason only. And that's what I'm doing. Are they asking because it looks terrible, or are they asking because my handwriting is terrible?
I'm not sure. I'll see if they respond back. Here's another question here. It's about, it says, what type of data was used in SharePoint?
Okay, well, we had all sorts of stuff. Well, really, we had one big list. I think we ended up pulling data in from another list that had to do with team hierarchy and structure and things like that. But the one big list that included all the information, that included all the measures and dimensions that we needed, was a very flattened SharePoint list. So it included everything about the claim that the auditors were auditing, hundreds of columns wide. In fact, we ran into issues in SharePoint running into the threshold caps, and we needed to work around different views for how different people needed to do SharePoint. And that was a good thing, and that's generally what you want to do with SharePoint. You don't just present the entire list to everybody. Different roles in the department had their different views on that master SharePoint list, which was huge. The custom.NET app used a specific view that it needed to avoid the threshold limits inside of SharePoint. So we had numbers, we had text, we had dates. We didn't have too many large text fields. We wanted to avoid those. In fact, the large text fields that we did have, we had to treat very differently. in the way they were validated and the way they were reported on. A lot of the large text fields did not make it into the cube because you don't aggregate on 3,000 characters of text and comments and of communication and logs and things like that. So a lot of those large text fields either we did not bring into staging or that we did not bring into the cube, but we left them in the data warehouse if they ever needed to be drilled down to. So that's a good distinction to make right there. So actually, I guess I am missing a bubble right here. We had some SSRS reports that were more tabular than others. Really, they wanted to show more detail level data in those reports, and so we did not use the cube for those. Not a lot of aggregations, more like tabular dashboarding kind of things, or not really dashboarding, that's not the right word, but just tabular reports, old style text reports. The SSRS reports that were based on the cube, however, could do all sorts of different graphs and pie charts and things like that we had some really talented BI developers sitting on top of that were really able to make these reports and some dashboards especially look fantastic when running SSRS and SharePoint integrated mode. All right, any other questions?
Okay, yeah, sure, we have quite a few.
Okay, here it comes.
One was they wanted to know about your whiteboard because they wanted to get one like yours. Going back to that one.
Yeah, the Wacom Bamboo tablet that I got is the entry level, or that I stole from my daughter rather, is the entry level tablet which can be had for under $100. I am not dealing with a giant touch screen. It's more like an overblown laptop touchpad. But for these purposes, I think it's working very well.
Here's another one about your dimensional model. Does it have a fact table with a star schema?
Yes. Yes, we used a Kimball method dimensional design. And I didn't want to get into much of that, but yeah, that is the process that we followed for facts and dimension tables. We didn't have to get too crazy with it. I think in the end we ended up with 5 facts and 15 to 20 dimensions. And that was really just, and I'll emphasize this again, that was really just in the prototype phase of this data warehouse. We designed this whole thing from end to end for a limited set of reports. We, again, did not take the strategy of dumping all the Excel data, all the flat file data, and all the SharePoint data into the staging tables and then into the cube. It's just a flood of information and you're not really sure how it works together. But when presented in the way of a prototype report, we know what to pull out. We know how to design our dimensional warehouse based on that. It was meant to be a very iterative design. And the client has a talented team of developers who are taking that design forward. Well, as far as I know, I don't keep up with them every day, but that was the design and that was how it was meant to be. The SSIS packages were designed very modularly so that they could easily be added to. And the fact and dimension tables, and especially that matrix, were documented very well to explain their purposes. When we needed to add other reports, we needed to figure out what data points we needed to capture, whether or not we needed to create new fact tables to provide new aggregations. That is really the decision-making process after the initial system is in place. Yeah, but good question. This was a Kimball method, fact and dimension table, star schema. Yep.
Okay. Here's 2 questions I'm going to kind of wrap into one. They're asking about change management. How did you address it for this project? And the second question is, how big was your project team?
The project team was, in the end, it was about a 9-month project, and we had changeover in the client's support team. I don't want to get into those details. I think we ended up having half a dozen, 1 or 2 of which at all times were dedicated to data warehouse architecture, and the rest were either SSIS developers or SSRS developers, and oftentimes they did both. Oftentimes when they were given access, when they were given an assignment for a report, they would also be in charge of not only designing the report, but resourcing the data, bringing it through the necessary channels if it wasn't already there. Change management was done. We were all using SQL Server 2012 data tools. So it's what they call BIDS now, but it's called data tools. And we were not using Team Foundation Server. They were using another source control system that integrated into Visual Studio. And so all of these things, the SSIS packages, the SSRS reports, the tables were in database solutions. This was all in source control, which was editable through Visual Studio, Visual Studio data tools. We had some members of the team who had a background more on the .NET side, and they were able to use these tools very easily because they were already used to working in Visual Studio. And that is a lot of the advantage of data tools. It uses the same sort of version control system. You're in Visual Studio, you're just using different modules to develop the SSRS, SSIS, SSAS, and the databases. I left that out earlier. The tabular model was checked in to source control, and when people made changes to it and worked on it locally, they could check it back in after they were done. Good question, though, and because a lot of times developers are not aware that you can check in and you can use source control for all these different business intelligence purposes. But really, every feature of SQL just about can be integrated with source control and data tools.
Okay. Yeah, we have a few questions on the matrix. So I'm going to ask 3 questions. I'm going to try and get 3 here because we have a few. Did you have one person dedicated to keeping the matrix updated? And let's see, here's another one on giving you an example lineage, matrix document. Can you show an example of it?
Oh, can I? No, unfortunately, I cannot show the actual matrix document, and I don't have a sample one ready to go. But imagine that it's very much like a data dictionary that has extra columns for the source of the data for every object in a data warehouse in a normalized data, and in the staging too. There's a tab for every table essentially in the staging database, in the normalized database, and the relational database. And that first question was.
Did one person manage it, or how many people?
One person management. No, it was definitely a team effort. We did not allow people to just cowboy their way around the matrix document and make changes all they wanted. It was definitely a team effort, but everyone was empowered to make changes to that matrix Excel spreadsheet, which was checked in with version history to SharePoint. So that part of it actually was not in source control. We used SharePoint for that and a few other documents as well. As SharePoint is very good for. It's very good for document storage and team collaboration on documents. And so we had version control turned on in the matrix document, and whenever people made changes to it, we could track that back. So no, we did not have, although we had 1 or 2 people at any given time of the project in charge of database architecture, oftentimes developers were allowed to make those changes, after discussing it in a team environment.
Okay.
Helps that we all got along really well, too.
So the tool you used for the matrix was SharePoint, correct? To manage it?
Well, it was Excel.
Oh, Excel.
It was an Excel document checked into SharePoint. I suppose we could have used the Excel web services online had it been in that environment. That would have been an easy way to do it. Then we would have been editing the Excel document in a browser. That would have been cool. No, this is actually just a regular terrestrial form of the Excel product.
Okay. Here's a question. I'm going to read it kind of verbatim because I'm kind of a little lost on it. It says, did you use SSIS to connect the SPs, I'm guessing stored procedure databases, for the staging process?
So I'll talk about that. I'm not really sure what the specific thing, but we used SSIS to connect to the Excel.
She came back and clarified SharePoint. Okay. So did you use?
No.
Okay, thank you.
We would have loved to have used the SSIS SharePoint data sources. We could not figure out a way to do that that would perform or just work, period, in SSIS. And maybe there's something out now, and maybe there's something that has been developed or a third-party tool. We ended up developing a custom .NET application using a custom .NET developer resource. It was maybe 2 weeks worth of effort. It was not that complicated to bring in every record of version history for every item. The way the application worked is that it kept track of where it was as far as the timestamp was when it finished, and then the next time it ran, it would bring in that data from the last timestamp, bring in everything in every version history row from the last timestamp. And it was still integrating with the SharePoint APIs as far as I understand, but I was not directly over that part of the application. So no, we would have loved to have done SSIS. In fact, we tried SSIS to get data out of SharePoint and into our staging database multiple times. We ended up going with a custom .NET app. I think that's a shortcoming of the integration of the products right now, and I think that's going to be improved soon. For the Excel files and for the flat files, we definitely used SSIS for that. And obviously for ETL2, that was all in SSIS as well. Good question, though. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's run into that as well, getting row-based data version history out of a SharePoint list.
Here's
they loved it. They loved their SharePoint list. Go ahead.
No, I mean, this is just a real interesting question. They just wanted to know what president was your project started under? Was it Bush, Obama? Do you even know?
He must be talking about the first project, and that was Obama. That was the stimulus package. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. What else do I have here? I think I'm catching up. Oh, here's another one that just popped in. Was MDS?
How about one more? Because I only got 11 minutes left.
Yeah, we're actually getting short on time, so this will be the last one. They're asking about MDS. Did you even use it?
We considered using master data services. It did not end up being used. That is a great question, and the more I think about it and the more I know about MDS, the more I think we could have used it at some point. The same with DQS. I think we could have used the data quality services as well. We did not take advantage of either of those products in this scenario. I think they would have both fit in, the DQS and ETL2 and the MDS more on the warehouse side.
Okay. Thank you, William, for your for the presentation today.
Hold on, I got one more. You want to call it?
What do you mean? Just you want more question?
I got one more project to go through.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought you were done. Sorry.
I'll go fast. Ahead. How about that? I will go fast.
Okay.
This one is kind of fun too. So this is called the Access Jailbreak. We've had multiple clients inside at SparkHound who have found themselves after a decade or more of development on Access databases just stuck. They have outscaled the concurrency, the very light concurrency that Access provides. They have become entrenched in legacy developers doing the VBA code. And so they've really been stuck in this master access database that's doing everything for them, from scheduling vacation to timesheets to their AP and their AR and their invoicing and everything. And so how do we jailbreak a company that is growing fast and being hindered by their access database? So let's break the access database into various layers, right? We have the access tables at the very bottom where the data is actually stored. And then we have the queries, and then we have the reports. These are the read-only reports at this point. And then we have the forms, which are for data entry and things like that. But the crowning on top would be the VBA code, which is a real problem. And that really does crown off, and I hope I'm not being too vulgar, it really does crown off our stinking pile right here of the Access database, which the company has found themselves eating daily. How do we break this out? The very first step and the most important step is to get the data out of Access via the linked table feature in Access into a real SQL Server database. And then we get all the advantages of DR and high availability. We get no caps on the size of data that we have. We get real concurrency. We don't get all this this jet engine stuff. We have 64-bit, first of all. A jet engine is still stuck in 32-bit. We get real enterprise level, come on now, real enterprise level security. Oh my gosh, and encryption. Things like that, especially with TDE, transparent data encryption on the files and the backup files. We get compression. And most importantly, and especially for us folks, we get real application lifecycle management, which is very difficult to do in Access. You can do all the copies that you want and taking copies every time and snapshotting the thing around. But in the end, being able to check in the individual modules, being able to check in a database solution is really a giant advantage when you're actively developing a system of this size. And so we get the data into linked tables, which means Access doesn't care. Access sees them as completely transparent. The data is actually stored in SQL, but Access is still accessing them via a linked table of the same name. And so it gets the data, and it gets the data much faster too, by the way, because the indexing in SQL is obviously much better. Eventually, we may have to involve SSIS to get the data over. And at first, we may use the import wizard to get the data over with only mixed results. Really, that's an incomplete solution to get the data over all the way, especially for creating the tables, because you're going to have to go back after the wizard and fix all the data types and things like that. So queries are next. Well, how do we get out of using these queries? We use views. We use sprocs. We use just better queries, which are not going to be filled with double quotes, right? Which everybody who's developed queries on Access knows and now hates double quotes, right? For the reports, assuming that they are read-only reports, this is obviously SSRS. And it could be in SharePoint, too, that you use SSRS, because SharePoint is going to come in handy for those forms especially. When we're talking about basic data entry forms, SharePoint is really the way to go. It is excellent at just creating a brand new data entry screen for someone to quickly type in data, copy in an invoice and things like that. And really we need to look at, with the VBA next, we look at all those different things. And the VBA is the most difficult part, because the VBA that we've seen that's embedded in Access forms and reports is very hard to consume. It is not commented very well. There's no ALM around it. And really, it's been Lone Rangered in by a legacy developer. And we've seen this in many different places. So if you're listening and you think that's you, I'm not talking about you. We've seen this all over, unfortunately, because Access is just too tempting, right? This is the biggest problem. Really, we need to look at .NET eventually. We can look at SharePoint. And really, we need to look at, though, better processes. Better business processes. Why are we still printing this out and having it data entered? Can't we integrate these systems together? And so in the end, we may be dealing more with SSIS to replace some of that logic than anything else. And we've had a lot of success doing that. And so we're talking about automation, really, is how we capture a lot of gains out of the VBA stuff. I'm sure a lot of people have questions or experience about that, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate as well. But that is the last one I wanted to talk about. That was a little fun, but really it's a lot more common than we all fear, right? So do we have any questions left in the few minutes that we have?
I just have one here that I can see. Right. DW Solutions, what is your preferred source control environment?
Team Foundation Server would be the preferred. I've used others, and Team Foundation Server usually wins in my book every time. The way that they do Team Foundation Server with Visual Studio Online right now in Azure is that if you have a team that's small enough, it's free. I think up to 5 people, it's free, and the TFS is hosted in the cloud. At SparkHound, we have a very large team, and we have a bunch of TFS administrators on board, so we can run our own TFS server internally. But the Azure offering for TFS is actually very good right now. And we are recommending it to our clients. And so yeah, that would be the easiest one. And I can say that educated. I've used Subversion and a few different implementations of Subversion actually, getting Ink installed inside Visual Studio. TFS just seems a lot smoother, and the check-in, check-out process and the way it retains locks seems a lot more logical to me. And maybe that's because I grew up on SourceSafe or Source Maybe.
Okay.
Right.
Well,
I think I'm about out of time. Any other questions?
This is just about your stylus. They want to know, what are you using about your stylus?
I honestly don't know enough. I know I'm using the stylus that doesn't have the eraser on the back. Okay. And I'm using just a regular old stylus. It actually doesn't even have a battery in it, and the tablet detects it just fine. Here's some information about me. I work at SparkHound. There's my email address. If you have any questions, please do contact me. My blog is at the bottom. That's where I'm going to post all the slide, well, I say source code and slide deck, but that's where all the printouts of these whiteboards are going to end up. SQL Server 2012 step by step. I did not write that. However, I was a co-author and a technical editor for it, and I can honestly recommend it as a very good book for people getting introduced to the DBA world. And that is out right now from Microsoft Press. And yes, Baton Rouge SQL Server User Group, brssug.org, and Baton Rouge SQL Saturday, August 2nd, although it's not officially announced yet because we haven't put pen to paper yet. That is our date that we're targeting, and I really hope to see you there.
Thank you, William. Thank everyone for coming. We're going to shut it down now, and thank you again, and talk to y'all later.
Thank you.